Did you get those from the dollar store? Hey, everybody, look at Grandma's little wings. The Marine's voice carried over the whole bar, pitched to land, and the laugh that followed was the laugh of a man who had never once been wrong in his life. He stood over the corner booth with a phone held sideways in one hand, the other finger stabbed toward the tarnished pin at the old woman's collar. He was young and broad and certain, 3 beers into a Friday 2 miles off the Fort Campbell gate, and he had found something to play with. The bar was loud that night, the way it got on a reunion weekend. Last light bled orange through the front window, and the neon over the taps threw red and blue across a wall crowded with framed unit patches and faded photographs. The place smelled of spilled beer and fryer oil, and, under that, the faint machine smell of rotor grease that the men who drank here carried in their clothes. Old aviators filled the stools, ball caps low, telling the same stories they told every year. Nobody had been paying attention to the woman in the corner. She sat alone with 1 drink in front of her, untouched, for the last 10 minutes. She wore a plain red jacket, zipped halfway, and her gray hair fell loose to her shoulders, neat and unremarkable. She might have been anyone's grandmother who had wandered into the wrong bar looking for a quiet glass and a place to sit. Pinned crooked at her collar was a small pair of jump wings, the silver gone dull and gray with age, the kind of thing a stranger would never look at twice. Sergeant Trent Maddox had looked at it twice, the first time to be sure, the second to make a joke of it. "Seriously," he said, leaning down so the phone caught both of them. "You jump out of planes, sweetheart? You? Or did you find those in a junk drawer?" The old woman set her glass down. She did not set it down hard. She did not raise her voice. She turned her head a few degrees and looked at him with the flat, unhurried patience of someone who had waited out far worse than this. "They're old," she said. "Like me." That got a bigger laugh. Maddox straightened, pleased, and looked back toward the 2 Marines at the high top behind him for the credit he was owed. They obliged. One of them lifted a beer. What none of them saw, what the phone did not capture, was the way she sat. Her back was against the wall. Her hands lay flat on the table, fingers spread, perfectly still. Her eyes had moved once, a single slow pass across the room and the 2 exits and the gap behind the bar. And then they had settled, and they did not flit again. She sat with the stillness of someone waiting out a long approach in the dark, when the only thing left to do was hold what you had and trust your hands. Behind the bar, Gus Renner stopped wiping the glass in his grip. He was 68, heavy through the shoulders, with a gray crew cut and forearms gone soft over a quarter-century of pouring drinks instead of turning wrenches. For 9 years before this bar, he had crewed in the back of aircraft that did not officially exist, and he knew, the way you know a smell from childhood, the bearing of the people who flew them. He looked at the dull gray wings. He looked at her hands. He looked at the way she had not flinched, not once, not even when the boy put a camera in her face, and something cold and old moved up the back of his neck. "Say hi to the internet," Maddox said, holding the phone closer. "Come on, Grandma." Big smile. She looked straight into the lens. She did not smile. She did not look away. She let the silence sit there, long enough that it began to feel like something. Long enough that the boy's grin tightened at the edges before he covered it with another laugh and turned away to his friends. Renner set the glass down very carefully on the bar. He had tended this room a long time. He had watched 1,000 young men come through it loud and leave it humbled. And he had learned that the loudest bars were the ones that went most silent, most fast, when the floor finally fell out from under them. He looked again at the corner booth, at the woman in the red jacket with the gray hair to her shoulders and the ruined wings at her throat, and he felt the floor of his own certainty shift. He did not know yet how he would say it. He only knew, with a flight engineer's instinct for the moment, a thing goes wrong, that the boy with the phone had picked the worst possible person in the state of Tennessee to laugh at, and didn't know it, and would keep on laughing until somebody made him stop. Renner reached under the bar and felt for the worn card he kept taped there, the one with the number he had never once had a reason to call. His thumb found the edge of it. Out in the corner, the laughter rolled on. She lifted her glass, took a small sip, and set it back down inside its own ring of water, exactly where it had been. The boy in the pressed civilian shirt did not know it, but the next half hour was going to teach him something the Corps never had. Maddox warmed to his audience the way a fire warms to dry wood. Emboldened by the silence he had mistaken for surrender, he sauntered closer to the patch wall beside her booth and jabbed a thumb at one of the framed cloth squares, a black shield with a winged sword and a scroll beneath. "Look at this stuff," he announced. "Night Stalkers don't quit." "What is that?" "A video game. You people make a patch for everything." He grinned at Castellano. "That your fan club, sweetheart?" The old woman did not turn her head. She spoke to the room in front of her, evenly, as if correcting a slow student. "That's not a door-kicker patch, Sergeant," she said. "That's the people who flew the door-kickers in the dark, 80 feet off the trees, no lights, when the weather was below minimums, and everybody with sense was on the ground." A pause. "When your kind needed pulling off a hill, that patch is what came for you." The line landed in the loose, easy noise of the bar like a stone into still water. A couple of the older men at the stools went quiet and looked over. Maddox laughed, but it came a half-beat late. "Okay, Grandma, you watch a lot of the History Channel." Behind the taps, Renner went still. He had stopped pretending to work. He looked at the woman's hands again, flat, motionless, the hands of someone who had learned a long time ago that wasted movement got people killed. And then at the wings, and then at her face, and the cold thing on the back of his neck spread down into his chest. He had crewed those exact airframes. He had hung out the side of them on a gunner's belt, with the wind tearing at him, and the green dark of the night vision world swimming below. And he had trusted the people up front with his life, more times than he could count. He knew the way they sat. He knew the way they watched a room like it was airspace, clearing it by quadrants, never letting their eyes get caught on one thing too long. He was watching one of them do it right now, in his bar, in a red jacket, while a child laughed at her. One of the buddies, a corporal named Shane Ruddick, bumped the table edge as he reached past for a bottle, and Castellano's glass tipped. She caught it before it went. One flat motion of her hand, set it upright, and never once took her eyes off Maddox. She had not looked at the glass at all. Her hand had simply known where it was. Ruddick blinked. "Quick for an old lady," he said, and tried to make it a joke, but it came out uncertain. The second buddy, a lance corporal whose name nobody would remember by morning, decided the moment needed rescuing, and he found the way that small men always find. "Hey, I got it," he announced, raising his bottle high so the room could see. "To the dollar store airborne. First in, last out. Batteries not included." He swung the bottle in a wide arc toward the corner booth. Maddox loved it. He seized the nickname like a man grabbing a rope thrown to him and ran it up and down the bar, repeating it, gesturing at the old woman as if she were an exhibit he had personally discovered. A few tables laughed along, the loose, nervous laughter of people who did not want to be next, and a phone or two came up at the edges to film the grandmother who was supposedly playing soldier. The noise of it built on itself the way a bad fire does, fed by its own heat, and for a minute, the corner of the bar belonged entirely to the boy. Through all of it, Castellano did nothing. She took a slow sip of her drink and set the glass down inside the same ring of water it had left, hands flat again, eyes level. She had spent her life in rooms that were louder and far more dangerous than this one. And she had learned a long time ago that noise was only noise. It was the quiet things that killed you. She let the laughter wash over her and did not give it a single thing to hold on to. They spoke in paragraphs, in toasts and nicknames, and performances for the lens. She answered in a few quiet words, or in none at all, and the asymmetry of it began, slowly, to unnerve the people closest to the booth, who could see what the cameras could not, that she was not enduring them. She was simply waiting, the way you wait out weather. The wiry old man with the white mustache had heard enough. He was a retired senior crew chief named for nobody's business, and he set both palms on the bar to push himself up, his face dark. He had crewed long enough to know exactly what it meant when a person sat that still, and the sight of a Marine sergeant making sport of one of them had put a tremble of pure anger in his hands. Renner saw him rise and caught his eye down the length of the bar and gave him a single, small shake of the head. Not yet. Wait. The old crew chief held there, half up, jaw working, then lowered himself back onto the stool. But he turned fully around now and kept his eyes on the booth. And he was not the only one. If you have ever watched the young forget what the old once paid, watched a room full of people laugh at someone who gave more than any of them will ever be asked to, stay with this one. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault and let the people who carried us be remembered out loud. Renner walked to the far end of the bar where it was quieter. He pulled the worn card off the tape under the lip and looked at the number on it, the one a reunion organizer had pressed into his hand years ago, and said, "If anyone from the old program ever comes through and needs anything, you call this. Day or night." He had filed it away as the kind of thing that never happens. He glanced back at the corner booth. Then he leaned to the younger bartender working the well and said, "Lo, leave the corner booth to me, whatever happens. You let me handle that one." The kid followed his eyes to the old woman and the laughing Marine, and clearly saw nothing worth the gravity in Renner's voice. "She okay?" "She's fine," Renner said. "It's the Marine I'm worried about." He took out his phone, stepped through the swinging door into the back hall where the noise dropped, and dialed the number on the card. It rang twice. "This is Gus Renner," he said quietly. "Down at the bar off Gate 4. I think—" He stopped, started again, because saying it aloud made it real. "I've got a lady here, older, gray hair, red jacket, wearing a set of master jump wings worn down to nothing. She just corrected a Marine on the lineage of the patch wall like she wrote it. And there's a Marine sergeant putting a phone in her face, and a couple of his buddies egging him on. I figured somebody at the reunion would want to know one of yours is in here and being treated like a joke." There was a silence on the other end of the line, then a voice, careful and very awake. "Don't let her leave. We're 4 minutes out." Renner put the phone away and stood a moment in the dim hallway, his heart going faster than it had in years. Then he pushed back through the door into the light and the noise, just in time to see Maddox reach down toward the old woman's collar. He moved a finger to the dull gray wings and flicked them, so the pin spun a half-turn on her lapel. "Loose," he said, grinning. "You should get those tightened up, sweetheart. Or, mounted. In a little frame with your participation trophy." Castellano reached up, unhurried, and straightened the pin with 2 fingers. She reset it square against her collar, smoothing the fabric beneath it, and lowered her hand to the table again. She did not speak. That nettled him more than any answer could have. A man who has decided you are a joke needs you to play along, and she would not. He leaned down and this time hooked the pin properly, popping the clasp, and the wings came loose in his fingers. He held them up between 2 knuckles, turned them so the camera could see, and then he let them drop to the floor and put the toe of his boot beside them on the sticky boards. "Pick 'em up," he said. The grin had an edge to it now. "Come on, show us how airborne you are. Bend down and get your little wings." The bar had gone quieter without anyone deciding it should. At the stools, 2 of the old aviators had turned fully around. One of them, a wiry man with a white mustache, set both hands on the bar and started to rise. Renner caught his eye across the room and gave a single small shake of his head. Not yet. The old vet hesitated, jaw working, and sank back down. Castellano looked at the wings on the floor. Then she looked up at Maddox, and for the first time, she held his eyes for a long moment, calm and unblinking. And there was nothing in her face that he could use. No fear, no anger, nothing to push against. "A man who'd grind another person's wings into the floor," she said quietly. "Never had to earn his own the hard way." Maddox's grin flickered. For just a second, something crossed his face that he didn't have a name for. Then he buried it under a laugh and looked back at his friends, and a few of the nearer tables, embarrassed, laughed too. Because that is what rooms do when they are afraid to be the one who stops it. "Come on, that's enough now," somebody murmured from a far table. But it was the kind of murmur that wants credit for being said, and no part of the trouble that comes from saying it louder, and Maddox did not even hear it. He planted himself over the fallen pin with his arms crossed, certain he had won, certain the silence around him was the silence of a beaten room rather than a gathering one. He had been in plenty of bars, and he had never once misread one this badly, because he had never before been in a room where every gray-haired man at the rail knew exactly what those dull little wings meant, and exactly what it would cost the boy to learn it. The young bartender at the well had stopped pouring and was looking to Renner. The wiry old crew chief had both feet flat on the floor now, ready. The whole place had the held, leaning quiet of a wire pulled tight and waiting for the weight that would either settle it or snap it. Nobody picked up the wings. Phones were up at the edges of the room, recording, and not one person crossed the floor. Castellano sat with her hands flat on the table and her back to the wall and waited, the way she had once waited on a pad in the dark with the rotors turning, while men decided whether to do the right thing or the easy one. At the end of the bar, Renner reached down and, without a word, picked the wings up off the floor himself. He came around the bar slowly. He was a big man, and the room noticed him move. He crossed to the corner booth, set the dull gray wings down on the table in front of Castellano, with a care that was almost tenderness, smoothing them flat with one thick finger, and then he turned and put himself between her and Maddox. "Son," Renner said, and his voice was low and flat, and carried further than the Marine's shouting had. "You have no idea who you're talking to. I'm going to give you the only gift anybody's going to give you tonight. Walk away, while walking away is still free." Maddox laughed in his face. "Or what, old man? You gonna throw me out? You and the geriatric squad?" He played it to the phone, sweeping the lens across the room of gray heads. "This whole place is a nursing home with a liquor license. I crewed those aircraft," Renner said, ignoring all of it. 9 years in the back, hanging off a gun, trusting the people up front to bring me home. I know what that pin costs. I know what it costs, because I watched what the people who wore it were willing to do for the rest of us." He looked at the boy steadily. "You don't. You couldn't. And that's the only reason I'm still talking to you instead of letting this play out." Something in the steadiness of it reached Maddox where the volume couldn't. He covered it the way he covered everything, with a sneer, but his eyes had begun to move now, checking the room, finding all those quiet old faces turned toward him, none of them laughing anymore. It was Castellano who broke the moment. She had been watching Renner, and now she spoke to him alone, in a voice pitched only for the booth. "You were a flight engineer," she said, It was not a question. 83 to 92. Twin engine, 5 blades, in-flight refueling probe. A small pause. You kept us in the air. Renner turned and stared at her. The blood went out of his face. He had not told her a single thing about himself. There was no patch on him, no cap, nothing on the walls with his name. She had read it off the way he stood, the way he'd handled the pin, the years in his hands, the way he had read her. For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other across 30 years and a sticky bar table. Two people who had lived inside the same impossible machine and understood each other completely. "Yes, ma'am," Renner said, and his voice had gone rough. "I did." Behind them, Maddox had finally stopped talking. He didn't understand what he was watching. He only knew that the old man he'd written off and the old woman he'd been laughing at were looking at each other like soldiers, and that the room had turned cold around him, and that the easy thing had somehow stopped being easy. What the boy in the bar did not know was what the next few minutes were going to teach him, and there are lessons the Corps cannot give a man that only a debt can. Stay with this one and subscribe to the Veteran Vault, so the next forgotten legend finds the people who need the story. Out in the gravel lot, headlights swept across the front window and went dark. To understand what was about to walk through that door, you have to leave the bar. You have to go back 37 years to a country most of the men in that room had only read about, on a night with no moon at all. Panama, the black early hours of the 20th of December, 1989. Operation Just Cause. Chief Warrant Officer Lorraine Castellano was 39 years old, and she was flying a special operations helicopter into a hilltop that everyone on the radio was telling her not to go near. A reconnaissance element had gone in 2 nights before to watch a road, 8 Rangers and a pair of attached scouts, and the operation had kicked off early and loud, and the road had filled with men who wanted them dead. They had pulled back up a hill that was steep on 3 sides, and they had been holding it through the dark, calling for extraction on a net that crackled with too many voices, and the answer had been the same each time. "Too hot. Stand by. We can't get you yet." Castellano had listened to the boy on the radio, and he had sounded like a boy, his voice cracking under the rounds going past him, for 40 minutes. She had the fuel, and she had the airframe, and she had a door gunner named Leon Mabry, 26 years old, who had clipped into his belt and racked his gun, and said over the intercom, in the flat calm of a man who had decided something, "Chief, I'm ready when you are." The wave-off came over the net as she turned inbound. "Abort, abort. The LZ is too hot. Do not attempt." A colonel's voice, far away and safe. She had pressed the floor pedal and rolled the aircraft toward the hill anyway. There is a kind of dark that the eye cannot fix on, where the world is only shades of green swimming in the night vision tubes, and the ground comes up at you as a guess. She flew into it 80 feet off the canopy. The hilltop a smudge of muzzle flashes ahead. The tracers found them on short, final, lazy and bright, and then suddenly fast, snapping past the windscreen, punching through the tail somewhere, with a sound like a hammer on a trash can. The aircraft shuddered. She held the hover by feel and by instruments, and by the 30 years of hands that had brought her to that exact second, settling into a storm of red dust that boiled up off the dry hilltop until she could see nothing at all, and flew the last 6 feet on the picture in her head. Behind her, Mabry's gun came alive. He leaned out into the dust and the fire and worked it in long, disciplined bursts, walking rounds across the slope, buying the men on the ground the seconds they needed to break cover and run for the open ramp. One by one they came aboard, dragging the wounded, 11 men where there should have been 10, and she felt each of them land in the shift of the airframe under her hands, and she held the hover and held it and held it. The aircraft did not want to stay. A round had found something in the tail, and the pedals had gone heavy and strange under her feet. And a warning light she did not have the attention to spare, for glowed steady on the panel, and the torque was climbing toward a number that meant the engines were giving her everything they had and would not give it for long. She flew it anyway. She flew it on the seat of her flight suit and the calluses of 30 years, and a calm she could not have explained to anyone who had not done it. The calm that comes when fear has been burned all the way down to its bottom, and there is nothing left underneath but the work. In her ears the voices tangled, the crew chief counting men aboard, a ranger screaming a name into the dark, the colonel still safe and far away telling her she should not be there. She tuned all of it out except the count. 9. 10. A young lieutenant came up the ramp last but one, dragging a wounded man under each arm, his face a mask of dust and blood that was not all his own. And for half a second, in the green wash of the dust, he looked up toward the cockpit, toward her, with an expression she would carry the rest of her life. The look of a man who had believed he was going to die on that hill, and had just been told otherwise. She did not know his name then. She would learn it, decades later, in a bar 2 miles off a gate in Tennessee. The last man came up the ramp, and Leon Mabry, leaning out past the edge of his own gun to cover him, was hit. She felt the change before she heard the call, a hitch in the rhythm of the gun, then silence from the left side, then the crew chief's voice ragged in her ears saying, "Mabry's down! Mabry's down! Go, Chief, go!" She pulled pitch. The aircraft clawed up off the hilltop with its load, and its holes, and its dead, cleared the ridge by a margin she never let herself measure, and turned for the lights of the coast on the last of its fuel. She brought 11 men off that hill. She brought 10 of her own home. The math never balanced, and she had carried the remainder for 37 years. They pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross on her in a closed room with the blinds drawn, because the program she flew for did not officially exist, and the men in the room could not say aloud what she had done or where. The citation went into a sealed file. The call sign, NIGHTHAWK, the one the rangers on that hill had used when they prayed into the radio for someone, anyone, to come, meant nothing to the world and everything to the handful who knew. She had flown another 6 years and retired a Chief Warrant Officer 5, and she had put the medals in a drawer, all of them, because they felt like they belonged to the men who had not come back and not to her. All but one small thing. She kept the master jump wings, worn down now to dull gray, and she pinned them on when she traveled, not to be seen, but to remember the weight of the people she had carried. There had been a funeral in a small town in Alabama that she had driven 11 hours to attend, and a mother who had held both her hands on a porch and asked her to tell it true. And she had, the only person who ever asked her that. She had told Leon Mabry's mother that her son had leaned out past the safety of his own gun, into the fire, on purpose, with full knowledge of the cost, so that other mothers' sons could come home, and that he had done it without being told and without hesitating, and that there was no braver thing a man could do. The mother had nodded and cried and thanked her, and Castellano had driven the 11 hours home and not slept. And that was the night she had decided which of her medals she would ever wear again. None of the bright ones. Only the wings, the plainest thing she owned. Because wings meant you jumped into the dark, trusting that the work and the people around you would hold. And that was the only part of any of it she had ever felt was truly hers. That was the woman in the corner booth. That was the joke the boy with the phone had decided to make. Back in the bar, Maddox made his last mistake. He was a man who could not stand to lose a room, and he could feel this one slipping. The old bartender had faced him down. The old woman had said something he didn't understand, and the place had gone quiet around it, His buddies weren't laughing anymore. Ruddock had drifted a step back, eyes on the door. Maddox needed to take the floor again, and he reached for the oldest, dumbest tool a strong young man has. He stepped around Renner, leaned down into the booth, and closed his hand, hard around Castellano's forearm. "All right, that's enough," he said, loud, hauling at her. "Up. Let's go. Get up and give the booth to somebody who actually jumped out of something. Come on, Airborne, on your feet." She let herself be moved. That was the thing that those who knew her would have recognized. She did not resist, did not jerk away, did not give him the fight he wanted. She came up out of the booth under the pull of his hand, smooth and controlled. And as she rose, her free hand came to rest flat on the table, and she turned her head and looked at him from a few inches away. "Take your hand off my arm, Sergeant," she said. Her voice had not risen at all. "I'm going to ask you once." And for one breath, Trent Maddox felt something he could not explain. It was the feeling of having grabbed hold of something he should not have touched, like closing a fist around a wire he had been told was dead and feeling it hum. There was nothing in her face. That was what frightened him. He had grabbed plenty of people in his life, and they had always given him something back: fear, anger, a flinch he could use. She gave him nothing at all, only that flat, steady attention. And somewhere underneath his certainty, a much older animal sense told him to let go. He let go. He didn't know why. He covered it instantly, stepping back with a sneer and a half laugh. But his hand had already opened, and he had already taken the step backward, and the room had seen it. Renner was moving. The wiry old vet with the white mustache was on his feet now, and so were two others. And the front door of the bar opened, letting in a wedge of blue dusk and the cool air off the lot, and the noise of the room began to change at its edges as the people nearest the door saw who was standing in it. A man came in out of the dark. He was tall and lean, and somewhere in his 60s, in a plain, quiet jacket, with nothing on it to mark him. But he moved through the doorway and stopped, and swept the room once, fast and complete, the way a man does when he has spent his life walking into places that might want to hurt him. The old aviators near the door came to their feet without seeming to decide to. The man's eyes traveled across the bar, past the taps, past the patch wall, and found the corner booth, found the gray-haired woman in the red jacket standing in the grip of a young Marine, and stopped. And the tall man went absolutely still. His face did something then that no one in the bar would forget. 37 years fell off it all at once. He looked for a moment like a much younger man on a hilltop in the dark, listening to a voice come down out of a storm of dust to tell him he was going to live after all. The grin was still on Maddox's face. He hadn't turned around yet. Behind him, the man in the doorway opened his mouth, and the whole shape of the night bent toward what he was about to say. The tall man crossed the room. He did not hurry, and he did not look at the Marine at all. He walked straight to the corner booth, past Renner, past the buddies who stepped out of his way without knowing why, and he stopped in front of Lorraine Castellano and looked at her like a man looking at something he had long ago made his peace with never seeing again. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was not steady. "Chief." And then, quietly, so that at first only the booth could hear it, he said the word that had come down out of the dust to a dying hilltop in another country a lifetime ago. "NIGHTHAWK." He said it again, louder, so the room could have it. "Night Stalker, December of '89. Tsero." His voice caught, and he mastered it. "You came when they waved you off. You came for us." The bar had gone silent now, fully, the kind of silence that has weight. Castellano looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face eased, very slightly, the way a held breath eases. "Lieutenant Easterly," she said. "You got tall?" A sound came out of the man that was half a laugh and half something else, and he had to look at the ceiling for a second before he could go on. Then he turned, and he looked at Trent Maddox for the first time, and his whole bearing changed. "Let go of her arm," he said. "You already did? Good. Then stand at attention, Sergeant, and don't you move." Maddox's mouth opened. "Who the hell are you? Old Lieutenant General Warren Easterly, United States Army, retired." He let it land. "I was a 24-year-old Ranger lieutenant on a hill in Panama with 8 of my men, and no way off it. And the woman whose arm you just had your hand around is the reason I am standing in this bar tonight, instead of being a name on a wall. She flew through a wave-off and a wall of fire to come and get us. She lost a man doing it." His eyes did not leave Maddox's face, and the boy's certainty was draining out of it now. Fast, replaced by a dawning, sickening understanding. And you put a phone in her face and called her Wings, a dollar store toy. Confusion, then disbelief, then the first cold rush of recognition. Maddox's face cycled through all of it as he finally understood what he had been doing, and to whom, and how many people had watched him do it. The blood drained out of his face in a slow tide. He looked at the phone still live in his own hand, as if it had become something venomous. He looked for his buddies, and found that Ruddock and the Lance Corporal had melted back into the crowd, putting bodies between themselves and the booth, abandoning him the way the loud always abandon each other when the floor falls out. He was alone in the middle of the room now, a big, strong young man with nowhere to put his hands and nothing left to say, and the silence pressed on him from every side. He started, and his voice cracked on the single syllable, and he stopped. "You don't speak right now," Easterly said, not even unkindly, which was somehow worse. "Right now you stand there, and you listen, and you learn what you've been laughing at. Can you do that much, Sergeant?" Maddox closed his mouth. He stood. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he did exactly as he was told, and nothing more. Renner had gone back behind the bar. He reached up to a high shelf above the register, behind the good bottles, and took down a small framed document that had hung there so long most regulars had stopped seeing it. Someone from the old program had brought it in years ago and asked, quietly, that it be hung somewhere it would not be remarked upon. He carried it across the room and put it in Easterly's hands. The general looked down at it. It was a copy of a citation, the official language stiff and bloodless, and saying everything by saying almost nothing. For extraordinary heroism, while participating in aerial flight, did with complete disregard for her own safety, in the face of withering hostile fire, effect the extraction of a surrounded reconnaissance element. He read it aloud, his voice carrying in the dead-still room, and the bar listened the way a church listens. When he reached the end, where the citation named the cost, where it recorded that the aircraft's door gunner, Staff Sergeant Leon Mabry, had been mortally wounded providing covering fire and had not survived the flight, something moved through the room. The wiry old vet with the white mustache stood up all the way. Then the man beside him. Then, in twos and threes, and then all at once, the whole bar got to its feet. Old aviators and crew chiefs and the wives beside them, and the young bartender, and the strangers who had wandered in for a beer and now found themselves standing without quite knowing the whole of why, only that a name had been spoken, and that it had cost something, and that you stood for it. Lieutenant General Easterly handed the frame back to Renner, faced Lorraine Castellano, and brought his hand up in a slow, exact salute, holding it. He rendered honors to her first. A lieutenant general, who in any other room in the country would be the one saluted, stood in a dive bar off Gate 4 and held his hand to his brow for an old woman in a red jacket, and held it, and did not waver. And the whole standing room understood without a word that this was the right order of things. That rank was the smallest part of what was being honored here. Castellano returned it. She did it the way she did everything, without flourish, a clean, unhurried motion, and for a moment, the two of them held the salute across 37 years, and a country neither of them had spoken aloud, the lieutenant and the pilot, the carried and the one who had come for him. Then they dropped their hands together, and Easterly let out a breath that shook on the way out, and the room stayed on its feet. Across the silent room, the phone in Trent Maddox's hand was still recording, forgotten, pointed now at nothing, at the floor, while the only person in the bar still seated was the man who had started it all, and he could not bring himself to look at her at all. The reckoning, when it came, was quiet, and it was worse for being quiet. A Marine gunnery sergeant had been at the far end of the bar the whole time, off duty, in town with the same joint training rotation, and he had come up out of his seat at the citation, like everyone else. Now he crossed the floor with a face like a thundercloud and put a hand on the back of Maddox's neck and said, very low, two words that did not carry, but that drained what was left of the color from the young man's face. He took the phone out of Maddox's hand, found the video, and held it out so the boy could watch his own thumb delete it. Then he marched him to a stool by the wall and stood him there like a recruit, and said something about Monday and the sergeant major and a long conversation that was going to happen whether Maddox wanted it or not. Easterly was not finished. He turned toward the corner to say more, the kind of thing a general can make happen to a sergeant who has embarrassed the uniform in public, and Castellano put two fingers on his sleeve. "Warren," she said, "let it be. Ma'am, he's a boy who never had to fly the wave off." She looked across the room at Maddox, sitting white-faced on his stool, and there was no anger in her face, only the long, level patience that had been there all night. "He doesn't know yet what any of it costs. Most of them don't, until they do. Let him learn it the slow way. The fast way doesn't take." If you have ever watched a quiet person be underestimated, and watched the room finally understand who they had in front of them, honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault, and let this old aviator's story find the people who need to hear it. She had Renner pour the boy a coffee, not a beer. Then she crossed the floor herself, the whole standing room watching, and she sat down on the stool beside Trent Maddox, this woman he had been hauling out of a booth 10 minutes before, and she set the dull gray wings on the bar between them. "Sit down properly, Sergeant," she said, though he already was. "I'll tell you what these cost. Then you can decide for yourself whether they came from a dollar store." And she told him. Not the medal. Not the citation. She told him about Leon Mabry, 26 years old, who had clipped into his belt and said he was ready, and who had leaned out past his own gun into the fire so that 11 strangers could live, and who had not come home. She told it plainly, in a few words, the way she said everything, and the boy listened with his coffee going cold in his hands and his eyes on the bar, and at some point during it, the sneer he had worn all his short life came off his face and did not come back. He had a mother in Alabama, Castellano said. He had a girl he wrote to. He was 26. That's a year older than you, Sergeant. He could have stayed inside the airframe behind the armor, and nobody would have said a word against him. The men on that hill would still have made it aboard. Most of them, maybe. But he leaned out into it, because leaning out into it was the difference between most of them and all of them, and he had decided a long time before that night that he would always be the kind of man who made up that difference. She turned the dull gray wings a quarter turn on the bar with one finger. "That's what this is. It isn't a costume. It isn't a toy you buy. It's a promise that when the moment comes, you'll lean out past your own gun. Some people keep it. Some people never get asked. You won't know which one you are until the night you find out." Maddox's throat worked. He looked at the wings, and then he looked at her, And whatever a man looks like in the instant his entire idea of himself quietly rearranges itself, that was what he looked like. "How do you carry it?" he asked, very low, so low it was almost not a question. 37 years. How do you carry it?" "You don't put it down," she said. "You just get stronger than it's heavy. That's the whole secret. There isn't another one." Later, when the room had settled and the old men had gone back to their stories with their voices lowered, Castellano reached up and repinned the wings to her collar. She set them straight this time, square against the fabric, and pressed them flat with 2 fingers. She did one more thing before she left. She took from her jacket pocket a coin, worn smooth at the edges, a unit coin from a unit that didn't have a name you could say, and she carried it to an empty stool at the end of the bar and set it down on the wood. She had Renner pour a drink and set it beside the coin, and she did not explain it, and no one asked, and no one touched it. The old crew chiefs in the room knew what an empty seat and an untouched glass meant, and they let it be. Trent Maddox watched her do it. When she came back past him on her way to the door, he stood up, clumsily, too fast, the way the young stand when they have finally understood something, and he said the only thing he could find, which was, "Ma'am, I'm sorry." She stopped and looked at him. For a moment she was reading him the way she had read the whole room when she walked in, clearing him by quadrants, and then something in her face softened by a degree. "I know you are," she said. "Go be the kind of Marine that Pin would have been proud to carry off a hill. That's the apology that counts." She nodded once to Renner, who lifted a hand he could not quite hold steady, and she walked out through the door into the dark. She had spent her life flying into an old woman in a red jacket with a pair of gray wings pinned straight at her collar, and the bar stood again as she passed, every one of them, without being asked. Gus Renner watched the door swing shut behind her. Then he looked down the bar at the empty stool and the coin and the full glass no one would drink, and he left them exactly where they were for the rest of the night. In the morning, he would frame the coin and hang it on the wall beside the patches, with no name under it, the way the woman who'd left it would have wanted, and he would never once have to explain to a single old aviator who came through what it meant. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.